So recently I picked up the awesome Kill Team starter set. Ta-da! Now, I wasn't actually interested in the models in this box, but it does come with a rather fantastic set of Sector Imperialis terrain, as well as the Kill Team rule set and some dice and things. So I actually flipped the models, both the Gene Stealer cults and the Mechanicus guys that you get in this set. I managed to get about 15 to 20 quid each for those two sets, and picked this up at a discount anyway, which meant that once I'd sold those models I'd only spent about 30 quid and I got a whole set of Sector Imperialis terrain for that. So in this video I'm going to show you what I did to paint those up. There have been some great painting tutorials online. I'm not going to pretend for a second that I'm a painting expert, but I didn't particularly like any of the colour schemes that I found online, and I ended up coming to one that I think looks really cool, so I thought I would share that with you. So give me a second, I'll flip the camera around and I'll show you what I did. So here we are. This is the finished article. This is what I came up with, and I'm just going to run you really quickly through the paints that I used and the techniques I used to achieve this. What I wanted to go for was a really rusted out, decrepit looking derelict building. These models, you know, there's a lot of battle damage, and it really creates a sense that these buildings have seen action. So I'd initially thought about the Games Workshop tutorial, but I felt that was too clean. So I ended up with this. As Games Workshop recommend, I started with an undercoat, just a nice thick undercoat using Xandri dust. You can get this in rattle cans, or if you've got access to an airbrush you could do it like that. Once that was dry I went round getting all the base coats on. So the first thing I did, and this is where the big difference was to create this very rusted metal. I actually used the airbrush to spray all of the metalwork using Vallejo Model Air Burnt Umber. And what I like about this is it creates this sense of rust. It's this nice reddish brown. As you can see, I wasn't careful at all with the airbrushing, so there's loads and loads of overspill onto the stonework. I really like that effect. When you look at derelict buildings and there's rusted metal, water will often have leached a lot of that rust out, and it will create this staining effect across the brickwork or the stone. So the overspill from the airbrush actually helped to create that sense of staining of the stonework. I think you could create a really similar effect using just a really heavy dry brush, not being too careful about, as I say, getting overspill, just heavily dry brush it all. If you can't get hold of the Vallejo paints, I think the closest Games Workshop produce would be the Rhinox Hide. Once that was done, I, in this case, painted these gold details here. Obviously gold and copper doesn't weather in the same way as iron or steelwork, so it wouldn't be as rusted down. I used Vallejo Model Air again, and this is just Vallejo Model Air metallic copper. You can find similar, proxies in Games Workshop, and I just painted those in by hand, being a little bit more careful that time. The flooring there, again, I painted by hand, and it did take a couple of coats to cover on the Xandri dust, but I just painted that in with Skaven Blight Dinge from Games Workshop. Once all of that base coating was done, I gave the whole thing a very liberal wash with your friend of mine, Agrax Earthshade. This is actually a really good quality paint from Games Workshop. I really rate that. What that helped to do was to kind of blend in the stonework and this rusted metal colour, and create a bit more detail and a bit more depth, particularly in that metal. Once that has dried, the whole thing was just done using a series of dry brushes. So for the stonework, just using a very, very big dry brush there. This is the largest dry brush I could get at Games Workshop. I began by doing all the stonework in Shabti Bone. I've just decanted my paints into these dropper bottles. It makes them a bit easier to use when you're storing them, and particularly when you're using the airbrush. I then dry brushed the flooring there with Storm Vermin Fur from Games Workshop. I then did a very, very light dry brush on the metalwork, and you do have to be very careful because if you go overboard with this, you lose that rusted effect. But a very light dry brush on all the metalwork using Vallejo Model Air Metallic gunmetal. Again, if you're looking for Games Workshop substitutes, I think lead belcher would be quite close. And this just helps to further bring out the detail on that metalwork. I then went over all of the stonework and the flooring with a very light dry brush of Games Workshop Screaming Skull, that one there, and that's just to kind of bring up the contrast on that stonework and the flooring there. And then finally, I just picked out a little bit of detail just on some sections of the metalwork with Games Workshop Riser Rust. Now, I did experiment with some sponge weathering techniques to get a more kind of dirty rusted effect on this metalwork. I actually found in this instance, although that can look really good on some models, it was too dirty for these. It's such a dirty kind of paint scheme already that I just found it was a bit overkill. So this is a really, really quick paint scheme. Lots and lots of dry brushing. The whole thing, doing all of the scenery in that set, took me a couple of evenings, and I'm really, really happy with the overall effect. I'm going to now... last thing. I did do a very light dry brush on the copper, just using Games Workshop Necron Compound. But any bright silver would do that, just to kind of bring up the contrast on this sort of copper looking stuff. Again, I experimented with weathering effects using Games Workshop Lilac Oxide. I didn't like the way that came out at all. This is quite a light colour, and because it's very thin paint, it naturally tends to sit, and when you look at verdigris on copperwork or brass, it will sit in the recesses. The problem being that because this is so light in shade, you lose the contrast and you lose the kind of shadows in the relief of those details, and it looks quite counterintuitive. It kind of it doesn't look quite right on these. I think on smoother surfaces this can be quite a good effect, but in this instance I painted back over it with the copper and had to do it again. So that's what I ended up with. As I said, I'm really happy with this. I will set up the board with all of the terrain pieces so you can see what the finished effect looks like. So here we go. This is the board set up with all of the terrain that comes in that Kill Team starter set, and I think it looks really effective. I think it blends quite well with the board, the terrain piece. It's not an exact match obviously, but I think it fits quite nicely with the colour scheme, certainly with the colour of this stone. I've set up, here we are, there's the Deathwatch Kill Team that I painted for a friend, which I've just set up so you get a sense of the scale. And this is really, really cool, this terrain. It stacks as well, so it's quite modular. You can create all kinds of effects, and it'll be really good for games of 40k as well. So there you go. That is my quick and dirty guide to how I did a quick and dirty paint job on the Sector Imperialis terrain from the Kill Team starter set. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you found it interesting or useful. If you did, please hit like or leave me a comment, and maybe I'll make another video sometime. If you want to get in touch, I'm over on Instagram on @dorkofmanythings. I will be posting some pictures of stuff that I'm working on and painting, stuff to do mostly with tabletop gaming, 40k, miniature games and Dungeons and Dragons. So if you're interested in that kind of nerdy shit, come and hit me up on Instagram. See ya.